The transport vessel Horizon's edge shook violently as it fell through the dark sky of 7. Danny Cole grabbed the armrest of his seat and watched the emergency lights flash red across the cabin. The ship was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. "Brace for impact," the pilot screamed over the alarms. Danny looked around at the other passengers. Ambassador X, a tall, insect-like creature with 4 arms and large black eyes, was praying in his native language. Commander Ra, a reptilian officer with green scales and a powerful build, was trying to reach the cockpit. Scholar OK, a thin amphibian with pale blue skin, had closed his eyes and accepted his fate. The others were screaming. The ship hit the frozen ground with a sound like thunder. Metal twisted and glass shattered. Danny felt his body slam against the restraints, and then everything went black for a moment. When he opened his eyes, the screaming had stopped. The emergency lights still flashed, but the alarms were silent now. Cold air was already creeping into the broken ship. Danny unbuckled his restraints and stood up on shaking legs. "Is anyone alive?" he called out. Here, a weak voice answered. It was the human medic who had been sitting 3 rows behind him. She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but she was moving. "Over here," Commander Ra growled from near the front of the cabin. The reptilian officer was pulling herself out from under a fallen storage panel. Danny moved through the wreckage and found Ambassador X unconscious but breathing. Scholar OK was awake and trembling, his thin body already shaking from the cold. Pilotin, a furry mammalian creature with pointed ears, was crawling out of the destroyed cockpit. Behind him, Danny could see the bodies of the co-pilot and 2 crew members. They had not survived. "The beacon," Pilotin said weakly. "The emergency beacon is damaged. I sent a partial signal before we crashed, but I do not know if anyone received it." Danny walked to a cracked window and looked outside. He saw nothing but ice and snow stretching to the horizon in every direction. The sky was gray and heavy with clouds. Wind howled across the frozen landscape and pushed against the broken ship. "Where are we?" asked as she finished bandaging her own wound. 7, Danny replied. "The frozen moon. Surface temperature is around -60 degrees Celsius right now. It will drop to -90 when the sun sets." The aliens in the cabin went silent. Danny could see the fear in their eyes. He understood why. None of their species had evolved for cold weather. The like Ambassador X came from jungle worlds. The like Commander Ra were reptiles who needed external heat to survive. The like Scholar OK had thin skin that offered no protection from cold. Even Pilot and species, though covered in fur, had adapted to mild climates centuries ago. Humans were different. Danny's ancestors had survived ice ages. They had crossed frozen continents and lived through winters that killed everything else. Cold was dangerous to humans, but it was not automatically fatal like it was for these aliens. "How long until rescue?" Commander Ra demanded. Her voice was strong, but Danny noticed she was already moving slower than before. "If the partial signal reached anyone, maybe 72 hours, Pilotin answered. "If it did not reach anyone, they will start searching when we fail to arrive at our destination. That could be 5 or 6 days. "We will not survive 6 days, Scholar OK whispered. His blue skin was turning pale and his whole body was shaking. "We will not survive 1 day in this temperature." Danny looked around the cabin. The hull was breached in several places. Cold air was flowing in freely. The heating system was destroyed along with most of the ship's power. In an hour, maybe 2, the temperature inside would match the temperature outside. The aliens would start dying soon after. Danny said, turning to the medic, "What supplies do we have?" Moved to the emergency storage compartments and began pulling out whatever had survived the crash. There were 6 thermal blankets, 4 emergency food kits, some basic medical supplies, and 3 chemical heat packs that would last maybe 4 hours each. "This is not enough," said quietly so only Danny could hear. "This will keep them warm for a few hours at most." Danny nodded. He had already known that. He looked at the broken walls of the ship, at the scattered debris, at the sheets of metal and bundles of wiring hanging loose everywhere. His mind began working through possibilities. His grandfather had taught him survival skills when he was young. Stories of men who lived through impossible conditions. Techniques passed down through generations of humans who refused to die. "Everyone listen to me," Danny announced loudly. The aliens turned to look at him. Ambassador X had regained consciousness and was watching with those large black eyes. Commander Ra crossed her scaled arms. Scholar OK stopped shaking long enough to pay attention. Pilot and leaned against a wall for support. "I know you are scared," Danny continued. "I know your species cannot handle cold like this, but I am human and my people have been surviving frozen wastelands for 100,000 years. I have a plan, but it will only work if everyone trusts me completely." "What can you possibly do?" Ambassador X asked. His voice carried the doubt that Danny had heard from aliens many times before. Humans were the youngest species in the galactic community. Many aliens considered them primitive and unsophisticated. "I'm going to keep you alive," Danny said simply, "but I need you to do exactly what I say when I say it. No questions, no arguments. Can you do that?" The aliens looked at each other. Commander Ra was the first to nod, then Pilot N. Scholar OK whispered his agreement. Finally, Ambassador X let out a long breath and nodded as well. "Good," Danny said. He turned too. "Help me gather every piece of loose material in this ship. Fabric, padding, insulation, anything we can layer." As began working, Danny walked over to Scholar OK. The amphibian was shaking badly now, his thin skin offering no protection against the cold that was filling the cabin. "You will be the first to show symptoms," Danny told him honestly. "Stay close to the others, share body heat. I'm going to build something that will save your life, but I need time." Scholar OK looked up at the human with wide eyes. "Why would you risk yourself for us? You barely know us." Danny smiled slightly, "Because that is what humans do." Outside, the wind grew stronger and the temperature continued to drop. Somewhere in the gray sky, the weak sun of this frozen moon was beginning to set. The long night was coming and it would bring death with it. Unless Danny could stop it. 6 hours had passed since the crash. The temperature inside the broken ship had dropped to -40 degrees. Danny could see his breath forming thick clouds in the air every time he exhaled. His fingers were numb and his face was stinging, but he kept working. The aliens were huddled together in the center of the cabin, had wrapped them in every thermal blanket they had, and positioned them in a tight circle so they could share body heat. It was helping, but it was not enough. Scholar OK had stopped shaking an hour ago, which was actually a bad sign. His body was starting to shut down. "What are you doing?" Ambassador X asked weakly. He was watching Danny tear apart a wall panel with his bare hands. "Collecting materials," Danny replied without stopping. "Insulation, metal sheets, wiring, anything useful." "You are destroying the ship," Commander Ra observed. Her voice was slower than before and her movements were sluggish. Reptiles were especially vulnerable to cold. Their bodies could not generate heat internally like mammals could. "The ship is already destroyed," Danny said. He pulled a large section of foam padding from inside the wall and added it to his growing pile. "Now I am turning it into something that might save your lives." Danny had spent the last 6 hours working without rest. He had stripped foam insulation from the walls, collected sheets of reflective metal from the cargo hold, gathered every piece of fabric and padding he could find. The pile of materials now filled one corner of the cabin. "I do not understand," Pilotin said. The furry alien had wrapped his long tail around his body for warmth. "How will a pile of garbage help us?" Danny stopped working and turned to face the survivors. He knew he needed to explain or they would not cooperate with the next phase of his plan. "Let me tell you something about humans," Danny began. "My species evolved on a planet that tried to kill us every single day. We had ice ages that lasted thousands of years. Winters so cold that the ground froze solid and nothing could grow. Predators that were bigger and stronger and faster than us. We had no fur, no claws, no fangs. We were soft and slow and weak." The aliens listened in silence. Even Ambassador X, who had always dismissed humans as primitive, was paying attention. "But we survived," Danny continued. "We survived because we learned to use our minds. We could not grow fur, so we took fur from animals and wore it. We could not hibernate, so we built shelters that trapped heat. We could not run from the cold, so we learned to live inside it." He gestured to the pile of materials. "This is not garbage. This is survival. Every piece of insulation I have collected will trap air. Trapped air does not conduct heat well. If I layer these materials correctly, I can create a barrier that will slow down heat loss." Danny walked over to a clear area of the cabin floor. He began arranging materials in a specific pattern. First, a layer of reflective metal sheets facing inward to bounce heat back. Then foam padding to trap air. Then fabric to add another layer of insulation. He built walls using broken panels propped against each other, creating a small enclosed space. This area is too big, Danny explained as he worked. We cannot heat all of it with just body warmth, so I am making it smaller, a tiny space that 6 bodies can actually keep warm. Helped him position the materials. She understood what he was doing even if the aliens did not. Humans learned these techniques as children. Every human knew about layering and insulation and heat retention. It was basic survival knowledge that had been passed down for thousands of generations. Within 2 hours, Danny had constructed a crude shelter inside the broken ship. It was small, barely large enough for 6 people to sit pressed together. The walls were layers of metal and foam and fabric. The ceiling was low, forcing everyone to crouch. There was only one small opening for entry. "Everyone inside," Danny ordered. The aliens hesitated. The shelter looked primitive and uncomfortable. Ambassador X stared at it with obvious distaste. "This is beneath the dignity of ambassador," he said coldly. "Then freeze with dignity," Danny replied without sympathy. "Or live without it, your choice." Commander Ra was the first to move. She crawled through the small opening and settled into the cramped space. Pilot and followed. Scholar OK had to be carried by because he could barely move anymore. Finally, Ambassador X swallowed his pride and entered the shelter. Danny crawled in last and sealed the entrance with a thick panel of foam. Inside, the 6 survivors sat pressed together in total darkness. The space was so small that Danny could feel the breathing of everyone around him. "Now we wait," Danny said. "Our bodies will heat this space. The insulation will trap that heat. It will not be comfortable, but it will keep us alive." 30 minutes passed, then an hour. Slowly, almost impossibly, the temperature inside the tiny shelter began to rise. It was still cold, but it was no longer deadly cold. The aliens stopped shaking. Scholar OK regained enough strength to speak. "It is working," the amphibian whispered with wonder. "I can feel warmth." "Human survival technique," explained. "Our ancestors used to build snow caves and heat them with nothing but body warmth. Danny is keeping us alive using knowledge that is older than your entire civilization." Ambassador X was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different than before, softer, humbled. "I apologize," he said to Danny in the darkness. "I have spent many years dismissing humans as primitive newcomers to the galaxy. I see now that I was wrong. Your primitiveness is actually your greatest strength." Danny smiled even though no one could see it. "We do not need advanced technology to survive. We just need our minds and our hands and our refusal to give up." Outside the shelter, outside the broken ship, the temperature continued to drop as night fell over the frozen moon. -50, -60, -70. Any unprotected life form would die within minutes in such cold. But inside the tiny shelter built from garbage and determination, 6 survivors huddled together and breathed warm air. They were alive, for now. Then Pilot gasped and collapsed. His body went limp and his breathing became shallow. The cold had reached him despite everything. Danny checked the alien's pulse. It was weak and fatting. The small shelter was keeping them from freezing, but it was not generating enough heat to save someone already suffering from severe hypothermia. "The shelter is not enough," Danny said grimly. "I need to build something bigger, something that can actually create heat." Hal asked. "We have no power, no fuel, nothing." Danny was silent for a moment. Then he began planning again. There was always another option, always another way. Humans had not conquered by giving up. "I need to go outside," Danny announced. The alien stared at him in disbelief. "Outside," Commander Ra repeated. "Into that cold, you will die." "Maybe," Danny admitted. "But if I do not try, we all die for certain. And I did not survive a crash on a frozen moon just to give up now." Danny wrapped every piece of spare fabric around his body. He covered his hands with torn pieces of thermal blanket. He fashioned a face covering from insulation foam and cloth. It was crude protection, but it was all he had. "You cannot do this," said. She grabbed his arm as he prepared to leave the shelter. "The temperature outside is -70 at least. No human can survive that for long." "I am not planning to survive it for long," Danny replied. "I just need to survive it long enough." He explained his plan to the others. The ice on this moon was not ordinary water ice. It was dense and compact, pressed together over millions of years. If he could cut blocks of this ice and stack them correctly, he could build an igloo, a proper shelter that would trap heat far better than anything he could construct from ship debris. An igloo, Ambassador X repeated. You want to build a house out of ice, on a frozen moon, while we are all dying. Ice is an excellent insulator when used correctly, Danny said. My ancestors built igloos that stayed warm inside even when the outside temperature was -50. The walls trap air. The dome shape retains heat. A properly built igloo can be heated to above freezing using nothing but body warmth and a small flame. You have no flame, Commander Ra pointed out. I will figure that out later, Danny admitted. First, I need the shelter. He crawled out of the small protective space and stood up in the main cabin of the crashed ship. The cold hit him immediately. It was like being stabbed with 1,000 needles. His lungs burned with every breath. His eyes watered and the tears froze on his cheeks. Danny moved quickly. He found a piece of sharp metal from the wreckage and fashioned it into a crude cutting tool. Then he walked to the breach in the hull where cold air was flowing in. He looked out at the frozen landscape. The storm had not fully arrived yet, but he could see it coming. Dark clouds were rolling across the horizon. The wind was already strong enough to push him off balance. He had maybe 3 hours before conditions became impossible. Danny stepped outside. The cold was beyond anything he had ever experienced. It wrapped around him like a living thing, trying to squeeze the warmth from his body. Every exposed piece of skin began to burn. His fingers went numb within seconds despite the wrappings. He forced himself to move. Movement generated heat. Stopping meant death. The ice beneath his feet was solid and smooth. Danny knelt down and began cutting. The dense ice was hard to work with, but he managed to carve out blocks roughly 1/2 meter long and 1/4 meter thick. Each block was heavy but manageable. He worked for 20 minutes before his body forced him to return to the ship. He stumbled back inside with 4 ice blocks, his whole body shaking violently. Was waiting for him with a thermal blanket. You are insane, she said as she wrapped the blanket around him. Probably, Danny agreed through chattering teeth, but I got the blocks. He rested for 10 minutes, letting his core temperature rise slightly. Then he went back outside for more blocks. He repeated this cycle over and over. 20 minutes of cutting, 10 minutes of warming. Each trip brought back 4 or 5 blocks. Each trip took more out of him. Inside the small shelter, the aliens waited and listened. They could hear Danny's footsteps crunching on the ice. They could hear him cutting and stacking. They could not see him, but they knew he was out there, fighting against the cold to save them. Why is he doing this? Scholar OK asked weakly. He had regained some strength, but he was still very fragile. He could stay in here with us. He would survive longer than we would. Why risk his life for aliens he barely knows? Because he is human, answered simply. We cannot help it. When we see someone in danger, we try to save them. It does not matter if they are family or strangers or even a different species. Humans protect others. It is in our blood. 2 hours passed. Danny had made over a dozen trips outside. His hands were cracked and bleeding now. Frostbite was setting in on his fingers and toes. His movements were slower and clumsier with each trip, but the igloo was taking shape. He had chosen a spot about 10 meters from the crashed ship, where a slight rise in the ground provided some protection from the wind. The ice blocks formed a circular base, each one carefully angled to lean slightly inward. As the walls rose higher, the angle increased, creating the dome shape that would trap heat so effectively. Came outside to check on him during his 15th trip. She found him kneeling in the half-finished igloo, placing blocks with hands that could barely grip. Let me help, she said. Danny looked at her. She was shivering already. Humans could handle cold better than the aliens, but she was not dressed for this weather, and she did not have his training. Go back inside and keep them warm, he said. I need you healthy to help with the medical care later. You will die out here alone, argued. Maybe, Danny admitted again. But if I die, you need to finish the igloo. I have shown you how the blocks fit together. The dome needs to close at the top with a single keystone block. Make the entrance tunnel low to the ground so cold air stays below the living space. Do you understand? Nodded. Her eyes were wet, but the tears were not from the cold. I understand, she said, but you are not going to die. You are going to finish this because you are too stubborn to stop. Danny smiled slightly. Stubbornness is another human survival trait. He went back to work. The storm was getting closer now. The wind was howling and the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. Danny's movements became mechanical. Cut the block, lift the block, place the block, repeat. His mind was foggy from the cold, but his body remembered what to do. 3 hours after he had started, the igloo was nearly complete. The dome rose about 2 meters high with thick walls of packed ice. There was a low entrance tunnel that would trap cold air. Inside, the space was large enough for all 6 survivors to sit comfortably. Danny placed the final keystone block at the top of the dome and sealed the last gap with packed snow. He stood back and looked at his work. It was rough and imperfect, but it would work. The ice walls would insulate them. Their body heat would warm the interior. They would survive. Then his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the frozen ground. The cold embraced him immediately. His body had nothing left to give. He had pushed himself beyond every limit, and now he was paying the price. His vision was going dark. His heartbeat was slowing. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was running toward him through the snow. The last thing he heard was her voice screaming his name. Then there was only silence and cold and darkness. Dragged Danny's unconscious body through the snow. He was heavier than he looked, and her arms burned with the effort. The storm was hitting full force now. Wind pushed against her so hard she could barely stand. Snow fell so thick she could not see more than a few meters ahead. She found the igloo entrance and pulled Danny inside. The difference was immediate. The wind disappeared. The noise dropped. Inside the dome of ice, the air was still and quiet. "Help me," shouted toward the crashed ship. Commander Ra was the first to respond. The reptilian officer moved slowly because of the cold, but she was still strong. She crawled through the snow and helped drag Danny fully inside the igloo. Then she went back and helped guide the others. One by one, the survivors made the short journey from the crashed ship to the igloo. Ambassador X supported Scholar OK, who could barely walk. Pilotin stumbled along on his own, still weak from his earlier collapse. Within 20 minutes, all 6 survivors were inside the ice dome. Sealed the entrance tunnel with a block of ice and packed snow around the edges. Then she turned her attention to Danny. He was not moving. His skin was pale and cold. His breathing was so shallow she could barely detect it. Frostbite had turned his fingers black at the tips. His lips were blue. "Is he dead?" Ambassador X asked quietly. "Not yet," replied. She began working on him immediately. She stripped off his frozen outer layers and wrapped him in the thermal blankets. She positioned the other survivors around him in a tight circle, using their collective body heat to warm him. "He saved us," Scholar OK whispered. "He destroyed himself to save us." "He is not destroyed yet," said firmly. "Danny is stronger than you know. Humans can recover from things that would kill any other species. We just need to get his core temperature up." The hours passed slowly. Outside, the storm raged with terrifying power. The wind screamed across the frozen landscape at over 100 kilometers per hour. The temperature dropped to -80 degrees. Any living creature caught outside would have frozen solid within minutes. But inside the igloo, something remarkable was happening. The ice walls trapped the body heat of the 6 survivors. The temperature slowly rose, -30, -20, -10. Eventually it stabilized at just below freezing, cold but survivable. Commander Ra watched Danny's face for any sign of movement. She had spent her entire military career believing that reptiles were superior to mammals, that cold-blooded creatures had evolved beyond the need for internal heat generation. Now she understood how wrong she had been. "He did not have to do this," she said softly. "He could have conserved his strength. He could have waited in the shelter with us. His chances of survival would have been much higher." "But ours would have been lower," replied. Danny knew that. He made a choice. He decided that saving us was worth risking his life. "Why?" Commander Ra asked. "I do not understand. We are not his family. We are not even his species. Why would any creature sacrifice itself for strangers?" Thought about how to explain. It was difficult to put into words something that humans felt so naturally. "My grandmother used to tell me stories," she began. "Stories about humans who ran into burning buildings to save people they had never met. Soldiers who threw themselves on explosives to protect their companions. Ordinary people who drowned trying to rescue strangers from floods. She said it was something in our nature, something that made us unable to watch others die when we could help." She looked down at Danny's pale face. "Danny once told me about his grandfather. The old man survived 3 days alone in an Alaskan blizzard when he was young. No shelter, no supplies, just his knowledge and his will to live. Danny said his grandfather taught him that survival was not about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about refusing to quit, about finding one more reason to keep going when everything told you to stop. Ambassador X listened in silence. He had spent 50 years as a diplomat, meeting representatives from hundreds of species across the galaxy. He had always considered humans to be unremarkable. They were physically average, technologically primitive compared to the older races, and they had only recently joined the galactic community. He had never understood why some species treated them with such respect. Now he understood. Humans were not remarkable because of what they had. They were remarkable because of what they did. They faced impossible situations and refused to accept defeat. They risked their own lives to help others without expecting anything in return. They built shelters out of ice in the middle of deadly storms because giving up was simply not in their nature. "I have misjudged your species," Ambassador X said quietly. "I have misjudged them badly." Around midnight, Danny's eyes flickered open. His vision was blurry and his whole body ached, but he was alive. He tried to move and found himself surrounded by warm bodies. The aliens had arranged themselves around him, pressing close to share their heat. "What happened?" Danny asked weakly. "You collapsed after finishing the igloo," explained. Her voice was thick with relief. "You almost died. We have been keeping you warm for hours." Danny looked around at the faces watching him. Commander Ra, the proud reptilian warrior, Ambassador X, the sophisticated diplomat, Scholar OK, the fragile amphibian, pilot and still weak but recovering. All of them were alive because of his igloo. All of them had spent hours huddled around him, sharing their precious body heat to keep him alive in return. "Thank you," Danny whispered. "Do not thank us," Commander Ra replied. "We owe you our lives. Keeping you warm was the least we could do." Danny closed his eyes and let himself rest. The storm continued to rage outside, but he could not hear it. The thick ice walls blocked the sound completely. All he could hear was the breathing of the 5 creatures around him, slow and steady and alive. "How long until rescue?" he asked without opening his eyes. "Maybe another 30 hours, Paladin answered, "if anyone received our distress signal." 30 hours. It felt like a lifetime, but Danny knew they could make it. The igloo would hold. Their body heat would keep the space warm enough to survive. They had food and water from the emergency supplies. All they had to do was wait. "We will make it," Danny said. He was not sure if he was telling the others or telling himself. "We will all make it." He fell asleep surrounded by aliens who had been strangers just 2 days ago. Aliens who now felt like something closer to family. The frozen hell continued outside, but inside the small dome of ice, there was warmth and hope and the quiet certainty that they would survive. Because a human had refused to let them die. The storm died 60 hours after the crash. Danny woke to silence. The constant howl of wind that had become background noise was gone. He pushed open the ice block that sealed the entrance tunnel and crawled outside. The sky was clear for the first time since they had crashed. A pale sun hung low on the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the endless field of ice. The crashed ship was barely visible, half buried under snow drifts. The temperature was still deadly cold, but the wind had stopped completely. Danny took a deep breath of frozen air and looked up at the sky. Somewhere up there, rescue ships were searching for them. He just needed to make sure they could be found. He spent an hour building a signal marker. He gathered debris from the crashed ship and arranged it in a large triangle pattern, the universal symbol for distress. Then he piled dark materials in the center, anything that would stand out against the white landscape. Finally, he used the last of the emergency chemical packs to create a small fire that produced thick black smoke. The others watched him work from the entrance of the igloo. They were too weak to help, but they offered encouragement and suggestions. Commander Ra pointed out better materials for the signal marker. Scholar OK calculated the optimal height for maximum visibility. Even Ambassador X contributed, remembering details about rescue protocols from his diplomatic training. 3 hours after Danny lit the signal fire, a ship appeared in the sky. It was a Galactic Rescue Authority vessel, a massive cruiser designed for emergency response across all environments. It descended slowly, its engines melting the ice beneath it as it landed. Before the landing ramp had fully deployed, medical teams were rushing toward the igloo. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Medical officers stabilized all 6 survivors and transported them to the ship's medical bay. Doctors treated Danny's frostbite and hypothermia. They told him he had pushed his body to the absolute limit and that most humans would have died doing what he did. Most humans do not build igloos on frozen moons, Danny replied. The doctors did not find this as funny as he did. Ambassador X was the first of the aliens to recover enough to speak. He called an emergency meeting with the ship's captain and demanded that a full report be sent to the Galactic Council immediately. "What kind of report?" the captain asked. "A report about what happened here," Ambassador X answered. "A report about the human who saved our lives. The galaxy needs to know." The report spread quickly. Within days, Scholar OK's recordings from inside the igloo had been broadcast across 1,000 worlds. People saw Danny cutting ice blocks with bleeding hands. They heard his explanation of human survival techniques. They watched the moment when the aliens huddled around his unconscious body to keep him warm. The story became legendary almost overnight. News channels called it the Miracle on Seven. Scientists analyzed the igloo design and confirmed that it should not have been possible to build it so quickly in such conditions. Military strategists studied Danny's decision-making process and declared it a perfect example of survival under impossible circumstances. 3 months after the crash, Danny received an invitation to address the Galactic Council. He stood in the Great Chamber on Nexus Prime, surrounded by representatives from every known species in the galaxy. The room was so large he could barely see the far walls. Thousands of eyes watched him from hundreds of different faces. Ambassador X introduced him personally. "3 months ago, I nearly died on a frozen moon," the ambassador began. "I was rescued by a human, a member of a species that I had dismissed as primitive and unimportant. This human built a shelter from ice while the rest of us froze. He worked until his body gave out and then his companion finished what he started. We survived because of him." Ambassador X turned to Danny, with genuine respect in his large black eyes. "Today, I present Danny Cole to the Galactic Council, a human who represents the best of his species." Danny stepped forward to the speaking platform. He looked out at the vast assembly and felt a moment of nervousness. Then he thought about the igloo. He thought about his grandfather's stories. He thought about all the humans throughout history who had faced impossible odds and refused to give up. "Thank you for this honor," Danny began, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. "But I did not do anything special on Seven. I did what any human would have done. I saw people in danger and I tried to help them. That is not bravery, that is just who we are." He paused to gather his thoughts. The galaxy looks at humans and sees a young species, primitive technology, short, soft bodies, and all of that is true, but you are missing something important about us. Humans did not survive because we were the strongest or the most advanced. We survived because we refused to quit, because we would rather die trying to save someone than live knowing we could have helped. Danny looked directly at the assembled representatives. "We build shelters in blizzards. We run into burning buildings. We dive into freezing water to pull out strangers. We do these things not because we are fearless but because we are more afraid of doing nothing. That is the human spirit. That is what we bring to this galaxy." The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Commander Ra stood up from her seat in the delegation. She brought her scaled fist to her chest in the traditional military salute of her people. Other officers followed. Then the delegation rose. Then others, spreading across the chamber like a wave until thousands of beings from hundreds of worlds were standing in respect. Ambassador X stepped forward and placed a medal around Danny's neck. The Galactic Medal of Unity, the highest honor that could be given to any being in the galaxy. "This medal has been awarded only 12 times in galactic history," Ambassador X announced. "Today, it goes to a human who reminded us all what true courage looks like." Later that evening, Danny stood on a balcony overlooking the great city of Nexus Prime. The lights of 1,000,000 buildings stretched to the horizon. Ships moved through the sky like rivers of light. Somewhere out there, beings from every corner of the galaxy were talking about what had happened on Seven. Joined him on the balcony. "How does it feel to be famous?" she asked. "Strange," Danny admitted. "I just did what needed to be done. I did not expect all of this." "That is exactly why you got all of this," replied. "You did not do it for glory or recognition. You did it because you could not stand by and watch people die. That is why the galaxy is paying attention." Danny looked out at the endless city. Somewhere in that vast galaxy, other ships were crashing on other frozen moons. Other people were facing impossible situations. And now, because of what had happened on 7, more of them might survive. The council announced a new initiative today, said, human survival training for all diplomatic and rescue vessels. They want humans on every crew to teach others how to survive extreme conditions. Danny smiled. My grandfather would have liked that. He always said that knowledge was meant to be shared. He thought about the old man who had survived 3 days in an Alaskan blizzard. He thought about the generations of humans who had passed down survival skills from parent to child. He thought about all the frozen wastelands and burning deserts and violent oceans that humanity had conquered through sheer stubbornness and refusal to die. Now that knowledge would spread across the stars. We should get back inside, said. The reception is starting soon and you are the guest of honor. Danny nodded but stayed on the balcony for one more moment. He looked up at the stars, countless points of light scattered across the darkness. Each one was a sun with worlds orbiting it. Each world had beings who faced challenges and dangers every day. Humans had spent 100,000 years learning to survive their own world. Now it was time to help others survive theirs. That was what humans did. They walked through any hell to bring others safely home. And the galaxy was just beginning to understand what that meant.